Welcome back to Artificiality. We are excited to have our guest, Chris Messina, with us. We're also excited to be back in the Bay Area, where Helen and I used to live for quite some time, and where we first started our AI journey. And we're very excited to be in a true recording studio, production studio. This is amazing. So we are in Berkeley at the moment at Ciel Media in Studio Zero. And I think we're early in the journey of recording here. So it feels kind of cool.
The launch party was last night.
Launch party was last night.
It pays to be early.
Yes, there you go. So we're early adopters, if you will. No, this is great, and it feels great to be in a true studio and to be here. And so, thank you to the Ciel Media team. We'll drop links and so forth to all of that there. But if you get a chance to check this place out, do. Yeah. Very cool.
It's really, really cool.
So, with all that said, thank you for taking some time to talk to us.
So I'm stoked you guys are here.
We're excited to be chatting with Chris, and I'm going to jump right into it. So,
please.
For those who don't know, Chris has a long history in product broadly and advising startups that need help with product, whether that's figuring out what your product is or how you're going to bring it to market. He also has the distinction of being the top product hunter on Product Hunter.
Yes.
Right? Is that I'm getting it sort of generally? And so
it's like a YouTube influencer for like products.
There you go.
Yeah.
So what I'm, we've been talking a lot about where the, I guess I put it as sort of where the gaps are between the potential in AI, generative AI in particular, and the actual product experience of generative AI. Now, for those of us who are in it a lot and the people who are spending a lot of time with these tools, it feels like these tools are very powerful because they are. But there's this sort of gap between that early adopter crowd that's willing to muscle the way through to figure out how to use something and something that actually takes off. And I'm curious from your perspective as someone who's constantly looking at new products, like, how do you assess this? What do you see that you're excited about? And also, like, what are you looking for that you don't see yet?
Wow. I mean, it's obvious this is a huge question. I spent last year as a venture capitalist in the AI space. Yeah. And a lot of our thesis was built upon the idea of vertical applications of AI, delivering value to very specific industries or to problems like sets that required a level of expertise or knowledge where a general purpose LLM probably wouldn't be able to route around certain regulations or local concerns and conditions and things like that. And what we found last year was just that there just was such a need for the build out of the infrastructure and the LLMs and the APIs and the capacity fundamentally that was restricting our ability to go deeper into the applying these things. Since then, and coming into this year, I guess I would look at your question from a couple different dimensions. One is AI more of a tool or a medium? And there are some implications for both of those directions, and it could actually be both. The other is ultimately the way in which people apply and adopt AI in their own lives going to be relatively straightforward and superficial, which I would say is extending the behavior and expectations that people have about software, for the last 15, 20 years. In other words, the more complex that software is, the less likely it is that people are going to figure out how to use it. And so the trend has been towards making things extremely simple and extremely basic so that the vast majority of people can use these things. So for example, the like button is probably one of the best examples, or the retweet or repost button, which has had deleterious effects on, democracy, but whoops. So people use the button, right? So it was engaging. And, the downstream ramifications then become clear once you get scale.
Sure.
And so if that's one end of the spectrum where many people are using ChatGPT, which we call Chad in our household, if many people are just talking to Chad and getting recipes because it's easier than going to a web browser and getting inundated with ads and all the rest, then they're not actually getting the full benefits of generative AI and AI in general. On the other side of the spectrum, you have a lot of developers or engineers or sophisticated people that have much more bespoke workflows where they're repeating a lot of tasks and where AI is like going to be really good at, you're never going to build software at scale for those particular use cases, but a savvy, they don't even have to be a developer, a savvy person who is able to be aware of their process and articulate the steps and then explain those steps to an AI and then explain some of the, error cases or the ways in which it might break down, perhaps to articulate that as like a long prompt and then give it to the AI to do, the AI will basically be able to figure it out and through a couple iterations, be able to automate that work. So what I'm seeing is a bifurcation, essentially, where you have very, very simple facile uses of generative AI for basic conversational things where like the chatbots now work. But then you have the other side of the spectrum where you have products like Raycast, I was an Alfred user for a long time, but essentially kind of like launchers that allow you to interact with more complex software. If you think about like even things like Zapier or Zapier, I always forget.
I do too.
Yeah, I know. I think everyone does. Yeah.
I think Zapier because I think of zapping something.
I know, it's same. I've heard both.
But people say Zapier, yeah.
The other one is even worse, like IFT, like IFTTT, like if this, then that. So there are these automation software like products that have existed before, but the barrier to entry and adoption is just understanding the use case and the workflow. And then they become very bespoke and like, deeply set in their ways. So we're in this period, I think, of migrating some of those workflows into the AI stack. And until those things become more, legible to a broader audience, I think a lot of people are not going to get the full benefit of this stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Maybe that's like a not satisfying answer, but that's my sense of it.
Satisfying because it's a good answer. I think it's, I think you're right at this sort of bifurcation. There's sort of the easy use cases, right? That people are scratching at. There's and
like
then
do
there's
my
the
homework
more
for me, write a report for me, like write an email.
Yeah, I saw somebody joking today.
Where the product is actually inherent in the prompt.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
sure.
I saw somebody joking today that it's okay to use ChatGPT to write your wedding vows because that'll give you more time to spend time at work. That kind of thing. So there's this sort of similar use case, and then the more advanced ones are different.
That was sarcasm.
I know it was. Sorry, definitely sarcasm. But I think about an old friend of mine who's he's one of the ex-derivatives trader, and he was telling me how he's used and he's been using AI for a lot of things over the years, and he said he used ChatGPT to write 90% of a routine that basically is an automated trading system for trading crypto. Now, first of all, you have to be, you have to have his own understanding of the knowledge of the markets to figure out exactly what he wants to do. I would not advise anyone to go off and do this.
It's not investment advice.
Not investment advice.
Not investment advice. You got to really have Cyrus's brain to be able to pull this off. But the capability of the tool to do all of that, and he could do it all himself. Sure. He's that talent. He's got the raw talent, but he's like, I don't have to do this anymore. Like I just tell it what to go do.
There's a lot of those statements that are coming out, right? Where it's like, I could do this myself.
Yep.
Or I can just let the machine do it. Yeah. And then there's a question of, and then what? Yeah.
But you still have to have that knowledge of the domain to be able to, and because you're delegating to the tool to do it. But there's something clearly missing, like you're saying, is that because the simple use cases are easy to do, but there's something about the prompt response, mechanism of these chat systems that's not actually making it apparent to people what's possible or how do they figure out what's coming out of it. There are some good use cases of it being behind the scenes, like in, I'll say Zapier. You can now start to use some plain language to try and figure out what your automations are.
Or actually, for example, like, and maybe this is a bad example because like instantly I was going to say like in Airtable, you can have it write like the SQL queries for you and things like that. Yeah. But that's actually no different than sending an email, except that instead of like writing to a SQL database, you're sending an email to a person. Yeah. And so you just need to know the magic incantations to cause the other person to behave in the way you want them to. So it's still the same use case. It's still essentially a translation layer of what it is that we're trying to achieve, translated in a way where whatever is on the other end understands our intent and then executes it. Yeah. Right. So like the IFT or Zapier example is exactly that. Yeah. You're just getting closer to the outcome. You could have done it before. You just had no idea how to do it or you weren't trained to do it. Yeah.
And there's still this sort of infrastructure problem. Like, so, could we use these tools to write our own applications to go off and do things, right? To assemble and analyze all the documents in the world to help us out with our research. Sure. You could run it on a desktop, but you still have that learning gap that if you don't understand how to set up a cloud instance that's actually going to run it all on yourself, you're kind of there's still this sort of gap of taking it to that true, bringing the advanced power to true usefulness for people who are not, in the, really technically,
I think there's this fascinating, I don't know if I'd call it like a divide, but, because of getting burned by things like the like button, there's a lot of conversation, and you guys have talked a lot about like alignment and guardrails and protections. And so giving people the ability to create AI generated applications that then run in the cloud and do things, quickly sort of arrives at the paperclip problem that everyone is so fearful of. And yet, without having the potential to get somewhere close to generating, 10,000 paperclips, you're not actually going to get the full value of writing a software application, right? So if every time you write an application, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't actually execute this, or I can't do that, then you start to learn that the system is artificially constrained in a way that inhibits experimentation, which in some ways maybe does lead to more preference towards open source or to open platforms that allow you the space to explore and to experiment. But I think where this goes and why I draw this distinction between tools versus mediums is that in a way, like the tool and mastery of the tool over time is what leads to mediums. Mediums are a substrate for conveying a message, perhaps between different, groups. I know this is very, very abstract, but for example, I was watching, I have a group chat where we send each other reels or short videos about people using these things. And this person wanted to learn French. And so they asked an AI to essentially build a flashcard application for them so they could learn French. And they didn't like the pacing of it, or they thought it was like too easy. So they asked the AI to like rewrite it so that it was like a little bit more complicated and had multiple flashcards so you could put together sentences. So that to me is more of a medium. That's like me thinking about some sort of expression that I want created. I ask the AI basically to take a stab at it. It tries. And then I'm like, not quite like that. And so the AI effectively like erases what it did and it tries again. And through that iterative process, you arrive at an outcome that's satisfying. Whereas I think a tool is sort of something that you apply to do work or leveraged work against, some task. So it's subtle, but I think it's important. And so a younger generation that comes up with generative AI being a kind of medium through which they can express ideas or share ideas, probably is what's needed to get us past this hump where we're thinking about or applying conventional software ideas and the high cost of delivering and creating software into this ether. So if you sort of like run it all the way back, the next generation comes up imagining that they can almost create anything that they want to, and then they can dispose of it. And it's like not a problem, just like you can dispose of like chats.
I think that's a really interesting lens, the tools versus medium. And it invites a completely different kind of mental model to this. And like I have another mental model in my mind, which is a bit more anthropomorphic. Imagine being brought up in a tiny little village. There's like 20 people in a tiny village, and then suddenly you're dropped in the middle of Manhattan and told to make friends. Oh my God. And to me, that's kind of what this feels like, is you don't really even know where to start other than you talk to the person that's closest to you and find out who they know, and you sort of explore your way through it. There's very few ways in these products that you're invited to have some sort of structured exploration of what the product can do. The one that I think of that I think is in this category of it when you see it and it seems like a really good thing, but it's in this instance, I think it's the right idea but applied in slightly the wrong way. Like I really enjoy in the Canvas style products, especially in ChatGPT, how you can adjust the comprehension level or the description level. That to me just feels there's something there that works and is right. What's wrong about it is my mental model of doing that isn't from grade school to PhD. That's just a dumb way of doing that. It just feels so overly structured and doesn't actually account for the true variety of the style that you want to communicate in. You want to be able to change to lots of different ways of altering that without mucking around too much with creating a style first. So it sort of feels like some of these are partway there, but they haven't quite clicked yet. And I agree with you, it probably takes an entirely sort of new conception of how to come to these products and how to structure them, but we still don't really have a model for how an individual person builds trust other than lots of time. Because it takes a lot of time to really kind of come to these things. And, we go through 2-day workshops to get people to the kind of like a relatively expert level of using them, but that's a lot of time. And have you seen ways where it accelerates how quickly you can get somewhere, but doesn't constrain it to a really stepwise, overly structured journey?
The thing that what you're saying sort of like brings up for me, one, I think the keyword of trust is really interesting, because trust in human culture and societies works in a very different way than in software. If you think about like trustworthiness, there's a sense of, maybe this comes from theory of mind, but the ability to predict what something else is going to do, to have some level of empathy for why it chose to do what it did, and then to see over some period of time that it behaves in a way that's consistent. So that if you want to rely on it to do something, as a trust fall might, imply, when you do fall, you'll be caught, as opposed to like you do it 6 times and the 7th time they drop you. Well, that actually erodes a lot more trust than those 6 other times that worked out well. And so when it comes to what you're describing, you guys just did an episode on DeepSeek, and one of the things that seems to be very compelling about that product is the way in which it shows its thinking. And so these reasoning tokens, the ability for the machine to explain to you, again, to anthropomorphize what it's doing, to sort of run through a mathematical formula that sort of shows you the cascade that arrives at an outcome or a solution, gives you some transparency into its thinking in a way that allows you to simulate empathy for this machine that brings you closer to it. And so then instantly you sort of like bond with it, because it's more like the way that you might think through something. And you go down these like rabbit holes of like thought, and you're like, oh, that makes no sense. Like, why did I go there? Like, let me go down this path till you arrive at the thing. And when you see a chatbot do that, as opposed to just streaming its answer, because like when it's streaming its answer, and like chat is like talking to you, and it's just like, this like huge, like long thing, you're like, wow, it's so smart. It's like some foreign intelligence. Whereas like, if you see it making mistakes, then that endears you to it in a very different way. Yeah. And so I wonder if that level of transparency and that type of transparency will lead, and again, I think it's going to be a younger generation that starts to intuit, like, okay, like I don't need you to do that, or like, don't think about it this way. And so people will start to anticipate the rabbit holes that these reasoning tokens might have gone down, and you can almost like prune them before it goes down that path.
Well, and there's also thinking about a few years ago, we wrote a book about decision making, make better decisions, and and it was all based on a series of ideas from a variety of different sort of academic leaders. And there was one in there that we call explain, teach, pitch. And the idea is that there's sort of 3 different levels. You're explaining, it's a generative act. We write about it, which is kind of interesting. We're talking about explaining and generative AI and so forth, but there's a generative act of explaining. And we're used to that. We have to explain our reasoning, but then you move up the level and you're teaching. So the difference there is that you have to understand where the other person is, and we have to meet them there,
well, you have
and
to
then
like
explain
measure
the difference.
delta. Exactly.
Right? Exactly.
And it's up to the teacher to respond to that delta.
Yes. And so there's something that I wonder about an unlock, in these products, as the AI is able to understand more of the context of each of us. Like if I prompted DeepSeek or something else that mimics what DeepSeek does, because now we're just in this massive mode of everybody copying everybody, which is another long question about how anyone's going to protect IP
Facebook
in this world.
Sort of did it first. And
of course.
Now they're getting screwed by their own behavior.
Exactly. I do like there is some of that.
The comeuppance
Justice
comes
in the
around.
world. It just takes 2 decades.
And they're complaining about people, DeepSeek. Jeez, the ultimate copier is getting copied.
Open source.
Yeah, exactly.
Works
It's kind of the way it goes. But when you think about it, if these tools get enough knowledge about us, and we haven't, I haven't really seen much of this yet. I haven't seen any evidence of it in, say, ChatGPT's memory, or even in the project function inside of Anthropic, for the model to be able to say, well, I know you know this, or I know you're coming from this perspective. I know you know this document that you already gave me that you wrote about. Now let me, in that
kind of
teaching,
like priors, right,
to can it understand enough about us so that when you're looking at that logic that's coming out, it's not just here's what the machine is thinking. I'll just embrace the
Sure.
anthropomorphizing because it's easier to explain. It's actually trying to teach something in the middle to say, aha, well, I already know you know this because you've already had this chat. Now let me show you what I'm thinking here. And here's the delta. I'm going to try and bring you from where you are to where I think you need to be in terms of answering this question.
Well, I mean, so much of conversation is like a game of Battleship where you're essentially trying to find concepts that are already lodged in the other person's brain.
Yes.
And so it's like, oh, you know that thing.
Yeah.
Let me talk about it in that way.
Yeah.
You know, as a visual thinker, that's kind of like how I understand and explain concepts to people. And so when I'm like, you know, I keep hitting the water and I'm not hitting any of their battleships, then I'm like, okay, I have to like try a different path, a different route. Whereas like a machine has no concept or knowledge of what the person who's interacting with them doesn't know. It's a blank space problem.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's in the negative space where you have to like unify what the model knows with what the person knows.
Yeah.
And then you can use metaphor or other type of concept scaffolding to bring them closer to a shared understanding. And so I like what you're saying, where on the one hand, it's like, well, what do you think we're talking about? You know, or like, why do you think I'm asking you this? Or what is it that you think my goal is? What am I trying to achieve? Yeah. And to the degree that can be modeled for these, you know, generative AI systems, there can be greater alignment to a faster outcome. Yeah. And I think this is like why when we think about how generative AI has been added to so many products, it's like the least interesting thing to do with it because it has to be done. So like Gemini is like showing up in all of different like Google's products, you know, because that's all that they can do. And, you know, they ship now that they're, you know, on fire, they can ship pretty quickly, but it doesn't mean that it's like solving problems for people because you're taking, you know, PowerPoint slides or Google slides and it's like, here, let me generate this for you, or let me summarize it. And like, okay, like fine, it can do that. But you're not ultimately addressing the problem that slides serve to solve, which is both visual explanation and compressing information in a sequence that allows you to have beats in a conversation. And so if you took that fundamental pattern of communication, then maybe you could have something a lot more elaborate. Or even as we're having this conversation, you can imagine, you know, if you've been to a conference where, I don't know if you guys had them, but where you have like an illustrator. It's like diagramming, like drawing the conversation. There's no reason why we can't have an AI doing that.
It's wonderful to watch that happen in real time. And it's this, as you say, a meaningful compression of information in context, and then it sort of gets reinflated in another medium. You know, it's reinflated into an image or something like that. And I'm sort of reminded of this overarching pattern of why we have a conversation. We're trying to solve some sort of problem together. We're trying to go somewhere together, and it's this. I think it was Andy Clark talking about how we're so loopy. I give you an idea, you do something with it. It comes back to me as a slightly different idea, this constant generation and step up. And there are some times that you'll work with these tools and that just seems to happen. But it's more that you're asking it the right questions because you really know what it is that you want. The least satisfying are when your intentions aren't clear and you're expecting the AI to kind of magically pop out with an answer that actually does two things. It clarifies your intentions in the first place, and it gives you an answer to this thing that you just sort of realized that that's what actually you want. And I think asking an AI to do both those things is completely unrealistic. But
sorry, I have like 10,000 thoughts that are like popping off right now.
Because like loopiness in action.
Yes. It's sort of like external digestion of ideas and then passing it back and forth like birds. And anyways, but I will oftentimes when I'm talking to Claude, like ask it to ask any clarifying questions before it does anything, and it'll actually do a pretty good job. It'll ask me like 5 or 6 questions, like, do you mean this? Do you mean this? Like, are you trying to do this? And I can answer them, and then the output is typically more aligned with like where I want to go. But to your point, and to my point about like negative space, the challenge is that if we have a set of, or a culture or a society full of people that don't know things, you know, or are only getting information that's pre-digested by the machine, one, they don't know how to ask questions of what's interesting or what's useful. And so they'll take the first answer or maybe the second answer that comes out and they'll be like, well, that's good enough. I find that like, and this is like probably why shame and insecurity will be the most problematic, like human sort of feelings or judgments going forward, because you have to be willing to accept and embrace your ignorance and your not knowingness to be able to ask questions when you can say, like, I feel like there's an answer here. And, you know, as a designer who's worked in the technology world and worked with engineers, I'm always the person who knows the least, you know, and where the engineers like know all the scaffolding. It's like, you know, like, I suppose it's like, you know, Googling an answer on like WebMD and like talking to a doctor and being like, oh, I think I figured out, you know, what this thing is. And the doctor's like, oh, I have like, you know, 18 years of experience.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling me the thing that the internet told you on one like Google search. Yeah. And I feel like that's going to be the case over and over and over again, where really, like, again, this bi-directional conversation that we have with these systems needs to be like, well, I don't really know what this is. Or can you expand on that a little bit? Or can you give me some other examples? The ability, I think, to mine that ignorance for deeper understanding is probably the skill which requires patience, which requires us to slow down to like the speed of information digestion, is the thing that students are probably going to need to develop more than getting to an outcome or getting to writing a paper or something which is full of sentences that they have no idea what they mean, but they track logically because an AI has basically done the background math to make it make sense.
Yeah, we've got
the selling process is so hard, right? You know, we've been in the business of selling process for like 20, 30 years between the two of us. And you know, when someone says, I want the answer, and you say, well, the answer is a process.
The answer is a question.
The answer is a question. I was sort of thinking training students not to supply an answer, but to ask the right question.
Yes.
But you know, you raise an interesting point where my mind wandered, and we're all doing the loops here. Thank you, Andy Clark, for this. Is the idea that you're saying that you sat there and you prompt Claude to ask clarifying questions, right? So that's a true expert move, right, to do that. And one of the things that we've sort of grappled with is this, what we dub the design illusion of LLMs, in that they're designed in a way that make them feel like consumer products.
Sure.
But in order to actually get the power out of them, you actually have to be a professional user.
Interesting.
And so it means that people approach this and they try it and they do this and they get a haiku or they get their wedding vows, you know, and then they go, what, you know?
Yeah.
Or they ask they put in one prompt and they get a response and like, well, that's not what I want, and they move on.
Yeah, that's right.
Like one of the first things we have to teach people when they've never really used these is this is not like a search. You know,
that's what I'm saying.
It's not a search window.
We've been trained to sort of expect, you know, with Google or whatever, the first.
And the interface looks like a search prompt, right? I mean, it literally is a search prompt, right? Or a chat system. But it's the first thing is just a search prompt. I want to have this recipe. And you get an answer. And like, oh, well, I guess that's it. Because I don't see any other thing. I can't scroll through new answers. I can't page through and see the next 10 things that come up through the search prompt. So it's designed to say, well, this is the answer. And you have to, first of all, learn to then have a conversation with it. And then you have to learn to be able to do things like you're saying, which is saying, now ask me questions before you give me an answer, right?
Right.
To employ the Socratic method with me, right? Like ask me, so to test my knowledge on this thing before like all of these tricks are things that you have to learn and you have to be taught. Like we used to have to be taught how to use professional software and have a big manual for it. And then we've gone into this world of consumer products that are simply and designed simply enough that they can just work. And, you know, I was just having the conversation now with our producer about the era 20 years ago when we were building out the iApps at Apple, which was the whole mission was they have to just work because Steve didn't want to ship any instructions with the iMac, right? It had to plug in and you turn it on and you see the happy
well, you know,
sign,
like I think that's such an interesting prompt to think about, like shipping the iMac in the era of generative AI.
Yeah.
Like what would that have looked like?
Yeah.
Right? Because like what if Clippy actually had worked?
Yeah, exactly.
Like I think the other thing is just like this point about generations I find to be really like profound in both understanding cultural norms and habits and the degree to which people are either willing and able to embrace new things or whether they resist. Because, you know, frankly, the meme that I've been hearing is just that last year there was a lot of like proof of concepts that enterprises and businesses, you know, were trying out.
Yep.
They do a little like small little experiment here that gave, you know, a bunch of YC companies like hope that maybe there's a there.
Yep.
And instead, mostly probably what they've learned is that a lot of people in enterprises don't really want to use this stuff either because it risks their job security because now they can be replaced, or their existing systems are sufficiently reliable that replacing them with something that is somewhat variable, even if it is faster, ultimately is less good than whatever it is that they're doing now. Yeah. And so it's going to require a generation to basically like be moved off or what have you, and another generation to come up that has a completely different way and approach to solving problems.
Yeah.
Which may be enormously more productive and effective, or they take a much less rigorous approach to the outcomes, but they're able to service or serve more people. So for example, imagine like, let's say that you have 1 million support queries on a daily basis or something. And all of them have to be executed like well and completed. And if you have anything below like 99%, then it's not good. Maybe a younger generation comes up and says, well, as long as we get 85% completed, because currently we're not even getting them done. Like they're just like, the queue just goes on infinitely.
Yeah.
We'll get to a greater degree of completion. Maybe they won't be perfect, but they'll be good enough that we can just keep moving. And so that embrace of variability might allow for these products to be adopted more broadly. I just don't know, but it feels like that's different.
There's an interesting thing you're touching on here, which has some precedent in a couple of different places. One is that, so if you're saying we need a different way of conceptualizing how to handle errors, because there'll be more errors. We're going to go to a world where we're more tolerant of false positives than false negatives. Let's just think about it that way. And because that just moves us on faster, and there's a cost to not doing things. We need to move ahead. And there's a precedent in the electricity industry of, because the whole electricity industry is completely obsessed with not giving customers a surprise on their bill.
Sure.
Right? That's just a very bad thing to do. Yep. And the flip that happened, this is a long time ago now, 10, 15 years, that one retailer said, we're going to accept the risk of getting that wrong, because actually these things, how people use energy doesn't really change that much. We're going to take that risk on and do a bit of a wash up later on, and we'll keep it totally smooth for the customer. We'll essentially take an electricity bill and productize it in that true meaning of the word product. And the way that was done was really quite innovative and very successful. But what it took was quite a significant cultural shift to say, we think this is going to work its way out. There's more benefit to customers in general being able to have that sort of obvious product purchase arrangement rather than just getting a bill afterwards, and we'll handle the uncertainty behind the scenes.
It's almost like through over-engineering, you get to a level of precision and regularity and execution through which you build up this enormous bureaucracy to maintain that consistency. And that slows everything down and creates a kind of sclerosis that inhibits innovation and trying new things. And so you're like, the thing works. Like, just don't touch it. Like, it's perfect.
So there's a lot of that going on. And I think there are many places we're seeing pushback against that and saying, yes, I see the benefit of all of the structure, but I also see the cost of it, right? So we're going to move to a different phase. We're going to move into a different place. Now, of course, there's contexts in which that is a terrible idea.
Sure.
But what I'm intrigued that we're sort of starting to see kind of live in the market right now is quite a few people coming to us saying, we see now the downside of how long our intake processes are going, or how long it's taking us to make decisions on things. How do we use both generative AI and understanding how to get people to think differently about risk and uncertainty and errors, and essentially how do we move to an exception management process rather than be driven by the exceptions?
Yes.
And we're seeing this kind of phase shift sort of starting to move through, even in really they have to be right. So poisons, toxicology, that kind of level, we're seeing people start to want to conceptualize a different way of doing it. Now, that's not a new generation. That's people saying there's got to be a better way. So I'm thinking that, I know that we're probably getting close to time, but it does make me wonder about this will accelerate agents because you've got a lot
Well, I think
more
you're talking
control.
about many, many things, right? So
Yeah.
on the one hand, like you're talking about risk and risk management and risk mitigation. On the other hand, you're talking about how these systems are designed and set up and how they may invariably need to reduce the number of variables that they support because the system becomes more brittle, the more expressive, or
the bigger space.
the bigger, the what is it called? The more dimensions in the space, it becomes harder to handle all those things. So if we're, and it's not the Overton window, but it's sort of an adjacent concept. I don't know what it is. Like moving from what you just described, where you've kind of mapped out like 90% of the surface area, and that's all you're going to cover, but you're going to have like nine nines of like execution excellence, to one where it's like down to like 80%, or let's say 80% coverage, but a greater number of either like APIs or agents or self-service solutions where people can solve problems for themselves. You can increase the dimensionality of the surface area that your product, company, whatever, addresses and solves for, by presuming that by combining generative AI with a person's ability to describe their own problems, they can have better outcomes. Let me try to make them more concrete. So I subscribe to a service called Sunbasket. It's sort of a competitor to Blue, what's it called? You said Blue Bottle, and now it's in my mind.
Blue Apron?
Blue Apron, thank you. Yes, the other one. Yes. Adjacent to
The food, not
my
the coffee.
battleship. Yes. Anyway, so Sunbasket is great because they focus on kind of organic recipes and things like that. Occasionally, there will be some ingredient that doesn't make it, as you might expect. There's a spill, there's an avocado that's like, bad, whatever. You can go onto their website, you start talking to their agent, and they walk you through this whole tree of getting very narrow and specific. Like, are all your meals affected? Is it just one? Is it an ingredient? You finally arrive at like the ingredient that is not good. And it'll say, cool, I've credited your account $15. Is there anything else you need? And you just like move on. And that ability, one, to like self-serve has created a very loyal customer, such that I'm talking about it here on a podcast. But also one where I, from a trust perspective, feel like I can remedy the issues that I'm having with the service on my own. And I don't need to, get someone on the call or the phone or whatever that's like very expensive for them. This starts to move more towards the world that I'm most familiar with, which is like the open source world, where I will go to someone's like GitHub repo, I will file an issue. Sometimes I'll even like propose solutions. Sometimes if I'm like feeling brazen, I'll like write some code with Claude and, submit a patch. This idea that you can start to actually collaborate with companies on the products and services that they deliver feels like part of this shift. Part of where the company says we're going to expose more of our guts and our insides and empower some of our customers, for those that want to go down that path, to actually solve and address problems for other customers. I'll give you another example. I use an AI note-taking app called Granola, and it's very simple. It just listens to an audio stream, transcribes it, and then creates notes afterwards. And they, like many other companies, have a Slack where their customers can hang out. And this is both how I learn, but also a sort of strange penance that I'm doing, I guess, that I am often answering other customers' questions and support like things as though I'm like a chatbot, even though I'm a real human. So for the people in Slack, I am human. And like I'm delivering a lot of value for the Granola team. And ostensibly, it's so that the Granola team can focus more on building the product than answering customer support requests that have already come through. Not that I recommend anybody else do this, but the point is that as they expose more of their internal workings, and you can delegate some, customers as your advocates, then that process, especially if you have a chatbot that's trained on your internal policies or whatever it might be, becomes sort of a forward way of building a new type of service or company that's more collaborative than simply one that's like a perfect, Nike shoe and it gets sent out to the, and like you'll never talk to your customer or whatever. Like it used to be the case, I feel like, that customer service was like the cost center that you always wanted to reduce. And now, customer service becomes like the product itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your Slack example, I got remembering eons ago, so this dates me. Back in the this was 90s era Macromedia, when we had a product called Director, and there was a guy named John Dowdell who worked for Macromedia, and he ran the DirectL listserv. And that was where everybody came together to try and figure out how the hell
in the early days, that's how it was.
Yeah, and it was a vibrant community. He was incredibly essential, to the community and incredibly essential to the company because he could actually, bring everybody together and actually and people could learn the product. That's still a thing, no matter what it is. So just one quick thing that I was thinking about that I just want to say, because I think it's interesting, is when you're talking about the error rate, and I know what you're referring to in terms of the electricity industry, is there's sort of something here when we're talking about probabilities and levels of error and how do we get accustomed to that. I think there is something like you're talking about that you can be a little bit more error prone when you have a community that's helping you figure that out, right? And there's also something that I was sort of wondering about sort of taking the sort of financial approach to it, and which might seem a little bit sort of out of left field, is like I was starting to think about where in the use cases of generative AI could you hedge out the answer. So if you can create a financial hedge for anything in the world, that means that there's
what that means.
So, for instance, you can have, for instance, like in the case of electricity, you'd say, I'm gonna have a flat rate for you, and you might have more, you might have less,
so
but I'm gonna have a financial instrument that's going to protect me from those things. So
like
I'm offloading the AI.
Yeah.
It's an insurance. I'm offloading that to some other player who's going to take that bet because they can see the variability of an electricity usage, or it's used a lot in renewables, in terms of production.
Sure.
If the utility doesn't cover it, whatever it is you got these financial hedges, and you think about the range of error rate. Is it something that you could conceptually say, yeah, somebody would create an insurance product or a hedge for that error? Then we might be in a zone that you go, okay, that's okay. Because a company could say, this is what I'm doing. I'm using this for this purpose. I know there's an error rate, but that's okay. I've actually contained my error rate in some way that's an acceptable level of risk. And you're giving a different example, which is I have a community of people that say, that's an acceptable level of risk because we're going to work together.
It's also about, again,
what is it that does that?
Capacity, generativity, possibility, co-designing.
Yeah.
And I guess, to go back to the beginning, like when I think about, like the hashtag was something that was sort of imposed on Twitter by me and several of my friends. And that is not something that they came up with internally, but we decided that was an expression of the product that we wanted to see. And then over several years, kind of built it into third-party applications that were built on the Twitter API. And that was the way in which gradually that behavior became part of the service itself. So I think I'm obviously deeply connected to this co-evolution where if you expose APIs or other types of, the inner workings of a product or a service, then you allow your community or your audience or your customers. Like I constantly think about this idea that products that are built now are actually artifacts. They're moments in time of a successful conversation that is happening between those who can build or create and those who are using. And so that bi-directional, just like we're talking about loops, like you building like Final Cut Pro, like maybe understood what you were building to a certain degree, but then the people who are actually using it had a much like they were running up against all the things you didn't think about, or you're like,
they talk us all about it.
Exactly. And that,
it becomes a community, and and I mean that's an old school. That was a sort of an old school way of developing software because everything was a release and you put it out on a disk. But everything about software development is about listening to your community, right? So you put it out there. I mean, spend a lot of time researching and figuring out. You put it out there and you take the feedback, and that becomes what the next release is. So there is always this co-evolution.
Yeah, I think so. So and the way that this has been solved in the past is through like plugins or through extensions. Like you have like the core, the foundation of whatever it is that you've built, and then you can like have little additions that are using typically known or public APIs. I think the question that brings us back to where we started from is, what are those like plugins or what are those concepts? What are those extensions to generative AI experiences that then allow people to share and to learn together to go beyond what you're saying, which is a chat box / search style interface that expands beyond what's currently possible.
It sort of jumps out that you need more dimensions than a screen for a start. Going back to DeepSeek, are you left with any intuitions about that reasoning explanation process, that thinking process that the machine went through? The ones I've seen are very long. They're really wonderful. There's sort of something kind of charming about reading them. But you'd get tired of it, or there'd be times when you didn't have time.
So let me tell you, like the way in which I learned. Sorry to cut you off, but the way in which I learned web development was through something called ViewSource, and like ViewSource is still there on the web, but it means a lot less now because so many websites are built with JavaScript and they're responsive, and you can't just kind of like look at the source code and sort of, make a few tweaks here and there, and then save it and then upload it to your own server and have it make sense. But to what you're saying, my intuition is that this reasoning window will probably last. I mean, it could be as short as a month or two, but people get exposed to a generative model showing its work, explaining how it thinks. Once you have that intuition, then you can turn it off. But if it's there, you can view source to see how it arrived in an outcome. Yeah. Then you might be able to go back into that and say, oh, I see where you went wrong on this, or I see where you made some assumptions that actually I didn't intend, or maybe it's a hominin or like some other words that, have multiple meanings. And so that's why you went down this path. So again, that's both building. It
feels very useful.
Trust and transparency, right? In a way where, if there are plenty of moments where my partner and I get into conflict, and sometimes those conflicts come down to just a misunderstanding of words, or where certain words are triggers for deep memories that go back from like before times. And a lot of our fights end up being kind of at this like superficial level of assuming that we know what the other person means.
But every time you have to go back.
Yes. But every time
and do a diagnosis on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, this is one of those zip file words that you need to like unpack so that I can see what's inside of it. And then I can relate to it. I'm like, oh, this isn't about me. This is about your ex, or this is about that time when like somebody misunderstood me and, when I was 6, or, whatever the trauma is. And man.
Oh man, I'm going to use zip file. I think that's going to come up at home. That's a really good one.
That's going to be going to be the code word for we need to stop that right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have one more question for you, because we're sort of there's one thing that you're sort of touching on a couple things, but I kind of want to nail it, which is we talked a little bit about these sort of interesting design features, whatever how we want to think about it. The like button.
Yeah.
The hashtag,
sure,
which you obviously have a very personal relationship with, that allowed people to tell other people about a thing that was important in that particular medium, right? So in social, you're trying to go find things that interest you. You wanted to see what other people like. You wanted to follow a topic. You wanted to see what it was. This allowed that system to create some level of communication with other people to help them find the thing they're looking for. You're now talking about looking at reasoning and then sharing ideas in a group chat. That's clearly not there yet, right? But there's something about the value of what these tools can do that we want to discover together. We want to share. We want to collaborate with. We want to learn from each other. And I know I'm asking for the impossible, what's your crystal ball kind of thing, but like, how do you think about what that like, or that hashtag or something, what would it be? Or maybe more importantly, what's the thing that it would share with each other? Like, you've got some good things, you're going to text it to me. I do the same back, right? But there's got to be something. What is it that we're trying to share with each other to make this technology actually more useful?
Yeah.
Or maybe we need to come back to that.
I mean, we might
someday. Sounds like a journey.
I know.
I mean, like, I was going back to the thought about the illustrator of the conversation, because as you're saying these things, 15 different visuals are going off in my mind that I want to kind of like come back to. I guess the thing that maybe is the most salient, given my experience with social media, in 2005, 20 years ago, I helped to co-organize this event called Bar Camp in Palo Alto. And it was the first time that the Web 2.0 kind of community kind of came together in person. We thought it was going to be maybe 30 of our friends, hanging out and having a good time, like, having some beers and like talking about the internet, as good nerds and geeks would do. But instead we had 300 people show up. And, TechCrunch was launched, and Flock, the browser that I was working on back then, was launched. WordPress's Automatic, I guess. Matt Mullenweg was there. We had a bunch of like, people that have gone on to do very interesting things. And I guess the point that I would share about what you're asking is that I feel like it's going to take a similar amount of time for us to really come into contact with the full impact of these technologies. Like, one, it's been 20 years, and 20 years is a generation. And so there's a generation coming up now that are 12 to 14 that will, like I was at the time, be using these things and have first contact. And all of my logic and all of the way in which I interact with the world will be based on that. While a bunch of old people, have taken over the White House and are in politics and are fretting about the loss of news media and all the rest. And, the 12 to 14-year-old set just could care less. Certainly they're downstream of a number of things that will happen, but in terms of the way that they use media, their whole understanding of things will be set based on what's happening now. So if you assume that that's roughly the right timeline, then that means that there'll be someone who comes along and does similar things to the like button or the hashtag for making sense of these generative systems in a way that allows them to share some type of perspective or view or experience that affected them in some way.
Yeah.
It also requires, though, that probably starting 2 years ago, going 4 years into the future, that more and more people will have to become clear about their own lived experience and their own ability to describe, label, and narrate what's going on for them, as opposed to just sort of like flowing through things without awareness. Because your ability to slow down and be aware of what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and what happened is going to be the degree to which you can catch something, like a firefly in the air and then show it to someone else. And that feels like a skill that many people don't have because of the pace of media so far. So the more that we're able to almost like create denser experiences of time for every moment that happens, almost like bullet time in the Matrix, the easier it will be to share these like moments of brilliance that will come from these systems, I suppose. Yeah. And then from there, that's why I think generative AI becomes more like a medium than a tool, because those who are able to do that will be able to like catch the generative AI going off the rails or doing something that's not what it wants and redirect it back to what it's trying to achieve. And you see this in like the way that Midjourney was built out in Discord, where people are just like running prompts against this thing to get closer and closer images to what they're imagining. And that's a type of experience that no human really has, one, the patience for typically, and two, the level of outcome that it can produce quite simply. And maybe again, that's very like vague and abstract, but it seems like the generation that's growing up producing Midjourney style images through a chat bot that is visible to everyone else who's in the same Discord like channel is entirely like a new way to learn. And so that I think is what we'll see maybe in the next several years to get to an answer to your question, if that makes sense.
It does.
Great.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Thanks again to the Ciel Media team. This is, again, a fantastic facility. So definitely
I'm looking forward to the
check it
sound.
out.
Sounding great.
Exactly. Yeah. I know. Much better than what we've been producing recently. Apologies. We will get our production down. No, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you all again soon.
Awesome. Thanks.